Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission Podcast. My name is Rebecca Twomey, and I'm here with my awesome co-host and sister, Rachel Smith.
Hi, everyone.
We are on a mission to encourage and inspire others as they navigate through this life and with their relationship with Christ. And today, we will be talking about the final biblical feast, the last one, and that is the Feast of Tabernacles.
Yeah, we made it. We're at the last one.
We've made it. So this is going to be very interesting because the last one has a lot of significance.
Yes. Yeah, it sure does.
Talk to us a little bit about it.
Yeah, I am very excited to talk about this feast because there's so many great nuggets in the Bible about it. And it is also the feast that many consider the most fun. So,
Ooh, what kind of fun are we talking about here?
well, wouldn't you like to know?
We've been talking about a lot of lamb slaughter, so I'm really looking forward to the fun.
This one actually also includes a lot of slaughter.
Oh,
But I think if you listen to last week and what we talked about, the Feast of Atonement, this one kind of has a shift to it. So,
okay.
So this feast can also be referred to as Sukkot, which literally means booths. So at
Booths.
Yes, booths.
And what does this word mean in this context?
So a booth is a tent or tabernacle.
Great.
So it's also like, we called it Feast of Tabernacles. Jews will often call it the Feast of Booths.
And kind of sounds like you're saying booze, like the alcohol.
I'm trying to pronounce the TH, booths.
I kind of like the tabernacle better, I think.
Yes, tabernacle's a longer word, but I actually just say Sukkot. I think it's the most concise way to say it, but the word Sukkot is plural for booths. And so that's why I just wanted to define that. And
so then could you also call it the Feast of Tents?
Yeah, you could call it that too. Tents, booths, tabernacles, sum it all up with Sukkot, and that's what I do. So
okay.
So as we have done with all the feasts, let's kick this one off with reading the command from none other than the book of Leviticus. So I'm going to start in verse 34 this time. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, on the 15th of the 7th month is the Feast of Booths for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day is a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work of any kind. For 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation and present an offering by fire to the Lord. It is an assembly. You shall do no laborious work. These are the appointed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations to present offerings by fire to the Lord. Burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings, each day's matter on its own day, besides those of the sabbaths of the Lord, and besides your gifts, and besides all your votive and freewill offerings which you give to the Lord. On exactly the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the crops of the land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord for 7 days with a great rest on the first day and a great rest on the 8th day. Now on the first day you shall take for yourself the foliage of beautiful trees, palm branches and boughs of leafy trees and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall thus celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It shall be a perpetual state throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall live in booths for 7 days. All the native born in Israel shall live in booths, so that your generation may know that I had the sons of Israel live in booths when I brought them out from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses declared to the sons of Israel the appointed times of the Lord.
I appreciate that clear enunciation of booths.
Yeah, this Bible translation used that. So that's why I had to say that a lot.
So I have a question real quick before we move on.
Mhm.
Last week, we talked about the Feast of Trumpets and the Feast of Atonement.
Mhm.
And there was a mention of the 7th month.
Yeah.
And then now we're seeing this again, the 15th day of the 7th month.
Yeah. So this is 5 days after the Feast of Atonement.
Great. That was my question.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So just like, do you remember the spring feast that it went Passover and that at sundown was Passover meal and immediately began the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Mhm, mhm.
And the very following day after the weekly Sabbath was the Feast of First Fruits. So it was within a few days. So it was like the first 3 feasts happen back to back to back to back within a week. And the same we're seeing here with the fall feasts. That
Okay.
first comes the Feast of Trumpets. 10 days later is the Feast of Atonement. And then 5 days later is the Feast of Tabernacles.
And these are roughly, they fall in September and then October.
Yeah. So our current calendar,
Mhm.
we kind of touched on how weird and confusing calendars are and how much they've
Yeah.
changed.
Yeah.
But according to the current Gregorian calendar and the months we have now, this feast or the month of Tishri, which is the 7th month in the biblical year, would fall either late September or early October
Okay.
in what we're currently looking at. But the calendar has changed even in the past, like, you know, a few thousands of years or
Mhm.
hundreds of years. It's changed many, many times. So
So the last fall feast is in approximately October. What about Hanukkah? Hanukkah is not considered one of the feasts.
mm-mm. No,
Separate.
Hanukkah. Yeah, so that's actually one thing I wanted to note that really stuck out to me as I was just reading this aloud now, even though I read it multiple times making these notes, is how many times did I repeat in that reading that God specified that this is a feast, this is his appointed day, this is his feast.
Yeah.
And that I just kind of wanted to highlight that as that's how I started talking about all of these feasts, is that there's this misconception that these are Jewish holidays
Mhm.
when we just read over and over again that's not how God considers them. He considers
Mhm.
them his holy days,
Mhm.
the appointed times of the Lord. So Hanukkah is not one of his appointed times.
Okay.
Hanukkah is based on a historical event that happened about 150 years before Yeshua was, you know, born. And that happened at the when the Romans took over the land and they took over God's temple and desecrated it, and the Maccabees revolted against them, and in a miraculous way these ragtag group of Jews beat the Romans and they took back the temple,
Mhm.
and then they cleansed it. And it's actually really interesting that you even asked about that when we're in this episode talking about this, because we can read about the historical, because what happened with the Maccabees is a very real historical event that happened.
Mhm.
And we can read about it in the book of First and Second Maccabees, which is part of the apocryphal texts, and it was found in the Dead Sea Squirrels, Dead Sea Scrolls. What's funny is Dead Sea Squirrels is actually these children's books that we read to our kids.
So they're a real thing.
But what I really mean is that the book of Maccabees is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I
Squirrels.
almost said scrolls again. Anyways, so this is a very real historical event, and people believe it actually has ties to the Feast of Tabernacles, because when this battle happened and they won back the temple, it was in the winter time. It was in what's now known in our year as December.
Mm-hmm.
And so they hadn't been able to keep the feasts for a long time, but they specifically, the Feast of Tabernacles, as we just read, you had to do these sacrifices in the temple
Mm-hmm.
and be in Jerusalem. This is one of the 3 feasts that it was required for all men to go to Jerusalem for. And so when they won back the temple, they cleansed it, which was a certain ceremony of, and by cleansing, I mean the Romans desecrating the temple. They literally slaughtered pigs, which are considered an unclean animal, on the altar of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Maccabees taking it back, they had to literally clean up the temple, but also ceremonially cleanse it. And then they celebrated what became known as the Festival of Lights, because they lit the menorah, which was in, it was commanded to be in the temple. And it's believed that them doing this was actually celebrating like a second Feast of Tabernacles. And that's the reason that, or one of the reasons that Hanukkah is 8 nights, just like the Feast of Tabernacles is 8 days. So it's not exactly the same. I mean, it's not the same at all. It's very different, and there's different reasons for it. But it's just, the idea behind it is they couldn't celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. They finally got the temple back. They dedicated it, and it's also called the Feast of Dedication or the Feast of Lights. And then they were able to have this harvest festival that they weren't several months before. So a big, joyous 8-day party. So Hanukkah is not a commanded feast in the Bible, but it's it celebrates a historically significant event. And I have grown to have reverence for it, because when we read in the Gospels, Yeshua walking through the temple, it was because of what the Maccabees did that he was even able to do that
Mm-hmm.
it belonged to the Jewish people again.
Yeah.
So,
Very interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It
So,
just made me wonder, because it's interesting that it ends in
the fall.
the holidays, technically the feasts end in the fall, but I know from our society that
Yeah.
there is still technically a Jewish holiday that's celebrated at the end of the year, right around the time of Christmas,
Yeah.
thus being Hanukkah. And so I was just curious about that. And I'm sure other people are probably curious about that too, because we've been talking about biblical things. And so it's interesting to know the history of that. And I know this is something that you've really studied into too, because, you've wondered yourself, like, is this a holiday or event that I should celebrate or recognize, or isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely have with Hanukkah, and the way that, just wondering and figuring that out. And really the place that we're currently landing is, like I've said before, we honor God's holy days because he wants us to, and he put it in his word. And anything else is just extra. And we don't feel like we need to do any of that. And that really, we're at the point that includes Hanukkah.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate the history there,
Mm-hmm.
and just teaching my kids about that, and reading from the book of Maccabees. And so I think there can be like an observance, but my personal opinion is it shouldn't be a bigger deal than what are actually the big biblical feasts. And what I've seen is Hanukkah, everybody knows Hanukkah. That's like the holiday that everybody knows as far as knowing anything about what Jews celebrate. And this is what I will just reiterate is the difference between what I believe and what Jews believe and practice. Because as I've said before, there's kind of a misconception that I'm just doing Jewish things. And I hope by the end of all of this, it becomes clear that this really has nothing to do with me doing Jewish things because they're Jewish. This has to do with me doing Bible things because it honors my Lord and Savior.
Great distinction.
Big distinction. And I don't think anyone who's Jewish would really connect with that very much. But I have a ton of respect for the Jewish people and even like some of their traditions and stuff. And I've tried to at least, mention to the best of my knowledge what some of those traditions are and how I might part with them, but have respect for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So take us through, and just to be clear, you read from Leviticus 23, chapter 23?
Yes.
Okay. That wasn't mentioned before, but I checked and I believe it's Leviticus 23 because you started in verse 34, but I just wanted to make sure the chapter.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. So take us through what you really want to highlight and talk about in this passage.
Yeah. So
besides the booths.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna depart from saying booths from this point forward.
Let's call it the tents.
Yeah. So a few things in there that I want to highlight is first, something that maybe you caught when I was reading, but that is that this feast is actually comes with a command to rejoice before the Lord. And this is why most people who keep it consider it the most fun feast, because essentially it's like a week-long harvest party. And like I had mentioned, and this is coming 5 days after the most solemn feast of Yom Kippur. So who says that Yahweh doesn't want us to have fun? Said it right there.
He said it.
Yeah. So secondly, the translation I read from used the term, like I had mentioned, booth, in reference to the dwelling places that they were supposed to build and dwell in for the week, to be reminded of the Israelites' time dwelling in these booths for the 40 years in the wilderness. And what the Hebrew word for booth is actually a sukkah. And it's a tent or a temporary dwelling place. And similarly to the other week-long feast, the one in the spring, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's supposed to be a tangible way for us to remember and live out this important time after the Israelites were delivered from slavery in Egypt.
This is bad news for me. I don't like camping. You have to actually sleep out there. Do you? Just kidding. But actually, that is a real question. First of all, what did they make their booths out of, do you think? Like wood? Was it more like a teepee?
So there is
there a description?
It's in another, I believe it's in the book of Numbers, and I didn't have that in my notes to read from. But there is another location in the Torah talking about the command for this feast that describes how they were to make these.
Okay.
And they were supposed to be 3 sides with a thatched roof, essentially like a roof with branches over it so you can see the sky through it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Hope it doesn't
And then
rain.
yeah. And then it has 3 sides to it.
3 sides.
Yahweh holds off on the rain
Yeah.
for that, week every year. So
So
that,
open on one side, kind of like a pop-up tent today that would have sides on it, but one side
yeah.
open so that you can congregate with people
Yes.
from the outside.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And traditionally, especially how it's done today, and if you were to go to Israel during this week, you will see these little, pretty small booths. And I'm using that word because it does kind of look like a booth, like, the booth you go in to like vote.
Okay.
They look kind of like that, the modern ones today in Israel,
Okay.
and they're set up all over the city, like crammed in people's patios, all over the roofs
Hmm.
of people's homes and in the streets, because essentially the way that people are traditionally doing it today is not that you live in it 24/7 for the whole week, but that you put up your tabernacle or your sukkah
Mhm.
in your yard outside,
Mhm.
not inside your house. And you spend time in it, a lot of times having people come and be in your sukkah with you, like for a meal
Mhm.
or,
Well, if
whatever
it's
it is.
one person, they're not coming in for a meal.
Right, right. Yeah. But if you got a bigger sukkah
What
and
kind
having,
of lounging do you have in this tent? Like what kind of chairs and stuff? Or it just depends on the size of it?
yeah, it would just depend on the size. Some people put a table and chairs in there so that they can,
Mhm.
have their meals in it.
Do you and
Um,
Chris build these with the thatched roof?
so we have, and we just like hang out in it with other friends of ours who are keeping the feast.
Mhm.
But what we really do as a community, and I think this is more the the and this is my opinion here. I think it's more of the Christian way of doing it from what we're reading directly from the Bible is we pitch a tent. We put a tent up, whether it's in our
Yeah.
yard
Yeah.
or we all go somewhere and we actually spend this week to go camping.
Mm.
And that really does
My
feel,
worst nightmare. Yes.
yeah, that really does feel like the closest to what the Israelites went through, being outside in the wilderness, camping for a week. And I will say, though, from my experience, we have yet to do this for the whole week. We do the sabbaths, the first day and the last day. And so far we have done some amount of camping for a few of the days of this week.
Ooh, I've just had a memory pop up. Pretty sure you were at the beginning of your pregnancy when this feast took place and you were very sick.
A few months ago, yeah.
And I remember everyone was sleeping outside, but you were sleeping inside. Not to throw
Yes.
you under the bus or anything.
So yes, this past fall we hosted Sukkot at our property because it was before we moved and we had a few acres. And so anyone who wanted to come, and we didn't do it the whole week. It was for, I believe, 4 nights. It was for about half of it, hosting just a big camp out. And
Mhm.
it was a lot to organize, to plan like food for so many people, because I think it was about 50 people. And it did kind of make it easier to be in someone's yard
Mhm.
because we could go use my kitchen to prepare any food or for the refrigerator or whatever. And then, we all did everything outside and
But you had so many people that I remember, I think you had to get, was it one or two porta potties.
2 porta
So,
potties. Yeah, we got porta potties, so it wasn't people coming in and out using the
oh my gosh, this was the
bathroom.
time that Jay got that spider bite.
Yes, yes.
So,
One
for those that remember Jay Carper, who was
from a
just on
few
this
episodes
podcast a
ago.
couple episodes
Yes,
ago,
he was there.
poor Jay got bit by a spider from one of those porta potties.
Yes, yeah, and it was so terrible because we kinda organized the days and the evenings that we would have worship. Actually, our theme for Sukkot was worship in the wilderness. And
Mhm.
so just reflecting on this time of the Israelites in the wilderness and, you know, what that looks like in our lives and being in the wilderness of our lives and finding ways to worship God through that. So we had a lot of worship, and my husband actually was giving a little teaching at one point, and then Jay was going to be giving a teaching on Sukkot, and we were all really looking forward to it because he's such a biblical scholar and has so much knowledge. And right before, like an hour before, he went into one of the porta potties and a black widow crawled up on him and bit him, and then he had to go to the hospital. And it was really it was really awful. And thank Yahweh that he is okay now. He was
Yeah.
actually in a lot of pain for a while. It was pretty, I learned a lot. I've never known anyone to get bit by a black widow. And you know what is nuts is we rented these porta potties from a company.
Mhm.
After this happened, it was like picture from Beauty and the Beast when Gaston and all the villagers get their pitchforks and their
And their
and the,
lanterns.
yeah, and all the men charged the porta potties and inspected them. They found the black widow that bit him and killed it. And they found a second black widow with a nest. And then they
Messed up.
inspected the other porta potty and found a brown recluse spider in it.
Hmm.
And this is like my worst nightmare because I have extreme arachnophobia. At that point, we
Yeah.
shut down the porta potties and we're like, everyone can just come inside and use the bathrooms. Like, it'll
So
be
you're
fun.
really just continuing my whole thing about
Why you hate
camping.
camping?
You're not making it any better. It's worse now. No.
You
And
know,
it's funny because I don't really, you're the one with more of the spider. Like you said, you had kind of arachnophobia since you were a kid.
yeah.
I, but the idea of this horrible. And the fact that this porta potty company wasn't cleaning these porta potty,
Yeah.
the fact that they had spider webs with poisonous spiders in them means that they hadn't been cleaned for a long time. And aren't they
Yeah.
supposed to sanitize them in between people?
They say that they did sanitize them, but they don't fumigate them for bugs. But it was very clear these things had been
Well,
sitting
can't you
in
spray
storage,
it out? I
probably
mean,
in
come
the
on.
woods.
What's that?
Yeah.
Say that again.
They had, it was clear they had been sitting in storage out in the woods. The fact that
Oh,
spiders would be making their homes in them like this.
yeah.
So, yeah, and we had little children using these. Like,
Yeah.
if one of the kids would have got bit by the black widow, like it could have been really bad. So,
Yeah, because a little kid might not be able to even vocalize what's going on, where at least Jay, he's a grown man. So he's like, this just happened to me and pretty quickly knew what was going on.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So, all of this to say, and what you even brought this up about is this happened just like 6 months ago. I was at the not just the beginning of my pregnancy. It was actually when my pregnancy nausea was
Yeah,
peaking.
it was at your peak.
It was the worst week for my nausea that I could not even stand up without throwing up
Mm-hmm.
constantly. So I was so excited about hosting this feast. I had planned it for months, and then once I was pregnant and sick and this was coming up, I was like, well, we're not canceling. Everybody can still be in the yard. I will just have to be in the house a lot because it was really hard for me to get out of bed.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up being really grateful that we still did have it in on our property because not only were Chris and the boys able to be involved in everything, but it was better than if we were going somewhere else to go camping, then I would have had to just stay home.
Yeah.
and have been
Yeah.
alone.
You would have been by yourself.
And instead I had wonderful women coming in my room, which I started calling my Sukkah, and laying in my bed with me and bringing me food and talking to me and making me feel better. And then the few hours a day that I felt okay, I would go outside and be a part of things and be a part of the worship. And so it was far from ideal. Definitely felt like a mental wilderness for me. And it was just such, I think it's a Sukkot that none of us will ever forget, especially with what happened with Jay, because it also it's kind of a great example. And as I kind of expound on more of the details of Sukkot, it's not easy, especially now, to be living outside for a week. And the Israelites had poisonous snakes biting them.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of negative things that can happen. But Yahweh sustains us and he's there with us. And so
Yeah.
even
He was
though,
definitely there with Jay.
yeah, so even though it was far from ideal, so was the 40 years of permanent Sukkot that the Israelites were living. It's not necessarily what they wanted,
Yeah.
but Yahweh wants everyone to remember that time. And this is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the feast. What I have learned about his word through the feast is that he wants us to learn things by doing, not by just reading it or memorizing it or hearing people talk about it. That just like children, the best way to learn and remember something significant is to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that just like, I think I said this with Passover, that Sukkot really feels like that too, that you're really remembering and getting into the feelings of the Israelites in the 40 years in the wilderness when you're camping, especially for a week, even though I haven't done the week yet. So
It sure would make you appreciate what you've got. And like, I think that so many times we can feel like, oh man, my situation or circumstance or whatever it might be, we might be looking for more. Well, you could have lived in a tent in Egypt for 40 years, surrounded by snakes, reptiles, and scorpions,
yeah.
and been a slave. And that
Yeah.
really was not a fun time.
Yeah. And I think what is really meant to be remembered with this feast is the time when Yahweh was literally dwelling with his people. And even though they dwelled in these humble tents or booths, they had the creator of the universe there with them in the pillar of smoke and cloud, sustaining their every need. You know, he was giving them the manna, he was giving them water when they needed it. And that just really feels like what he still does for us today. So we can live that out.
Yeah.
We can practice it ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So like the Feast of Unleavened Bread, this feast also includes 2 Sabbaths, on the first day and the last day, this time the 8th day, simply meaning everyone is to rest and do no work, like all the Sabbaths mean, which in my experience is exactly what one needs after a week-long camping party. You need a whole day to decompress. So there were times in history, like when King Solomon ruled, that this was considered the most important feast. And there are several reasons for that. But interestingly, the first century and earlier Jews all recognized this feast as being prophetic and specifically of the Messiah. And the reason for that was because of prophets like Zechariah's writings. So I'm going to read, excuse me, I'm going to read directly from Zechariah 14, verses 16 through 19. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. So this passage is pretty fascinating because Zechariah was writing about the millennial reign of the Messiah after the apocalypse takes place. So this event has yet to happen. And what's so important to note here is this is exactly how Yeshua will fulfill this feast in the future, and anyone in his kingdom will be celebrating this feast. I mean, I think it said it 3 times there. If you don't go up and do this, you're not going to have rain on your land. So that there's a lot of interesting implications there, that this, you can still disobey, you can still choose, but if you don't, there's a punishment for it.
Yeah. Gotta watch
And
out.
yeah. So when I read this for the first time, my mentality was, if I'm going to be doing this in Yahweh's kingdom, then why not start practicing it now?
Mm-hmm.
I may not be getting it right on this side of eternity. I mean, we really can't do this one right because I'm not in the land. I can't go to Jerusalem every year.
Mm-hmm.
There's no temple, so we can't do the sacrifices.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it's like practice, and at least I'll be familiar with it. And
Mm-hmm.
in that time, in the fullness, when the fullness of this feast comes about, it will be so obvious to us all. And at least I'll be like, oh, okay, so this is how we're going to do it. It's going to be, it's not going to be like
Little
shocking.
muscle memory there.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why in my mind, it's like, why not practice it?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just wild to me that the first century Jews identified Sukkot with the king reigning in his established kingdom. So this feast was the one that anticipated the king's glorious reign, not only over Israel, but over all of the nations.
Mm-hmm.
And this is exactly why we see at the end of the book, when John writes of the same events in the book of Revelation. Which brings me to another detail I wanted to talk about with Sukkot, and that is the fact that it is most likely when Yeshua was actually born on the first day of Sukkot.
Mm.
So,
Wait, this happens in October? Was Jesus born on my birthday? No, I'm just kidding.
actually, it would have been closer to my birthday.
Just so you guys know, both of our birthdays are in
Mhm.
October. Rachel is the 4th,
Mine's
and
the
I'm the
first week.
19th.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, actually, wasn't Sukkot on like the 8th or something this past year? It was around, because it was like, I think the week after your birthday.
Yes. There are times where my birthday
So it's
falls in
in
Sukkot.
between our birthdays.
Yeah, it was this past year. Actually, you know what? My birthday this year was the day that Feast of Atonement was starting. So 5 days before Sukkot.
Oh.
Because we were planning to fast. I mean, I was pregnant, so I wasn't going to fast from food. But it usually starts at sundown, and it was sundown on my birthday. So Chris fasted.
I Googled it. Sukkot started in 2022, October 9th, and
Yeah.
ended October 16th.
Yeah. That's close.
So It's close. Yeah. If Yeshua was born the first day, although in 2023, it's September 29th or October 6th.
Yeah. See, it
So it's
changes.
hard for us to know, but you're right. It probably is closer to your birthday than mine.
Yeah. And I will say, we can't know for sure that this is when he was born
Mhm.
because none of the gospel writers actually tell us the exact date of
Mhm.
his birth.
Do you think there's a reason for that? Is it just to
Yes.
like mess with us, to
No.
make us crazy, or what?
I think about after every small little detail that God has given us, like specifying to the day each of these feasts. Like think about how specific
Yeah.
he's
When
gotten.
the moon rises on the seventh month of the
Yeah,
seventh day. And
exactly.
then it's like,
Doesn't it?
oh, the Lord and Savior's day of birth omitted. Totally.
So
It's like
doesn't
he's
it
a
seem?
mystery.
Yeah, doesn't it seem like if he wanted us to know the day, he would have given it to us?
That's a good point.
So I believe he did not give it to us because he didn't want people worshiping the day. And doesn't it sound like something that people would do?
I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I think that there's a reason he misses no detail. And I'm going to go into that a little bit, but he misses no detail. I think he did not want us to know the day. But not only that, it was not Jewish tradition to actually celebrate or even recognize one's birthday. What was more significant to Jews was the day of their death.
Well, they probably didn't have a really good tracking system back then. You know, they didn't have these iPhones and everything. They probably didn't even know what day it was. I don't know.
Well, the Jews did because they had to keep track of all these feasts.
But they were tracking by the moons, that's easy.
Yeah, that's actually tracking things by the moons really does make things easier. I feel like our culture has gotten so far away with things that, like that, like we're so dependent on, having a phone that tells us, or even
Yeah,
a
could you
written
imagine
out
having to try to
calendar.
track your birthday back then from the time that you were born? You can't. So you miss the first however many years, and then you're etching on, pieces of logs or pieces of stone to just try to keep it. It must have been so hard to keep track. No wonder why they didn't celebrate birthdays.
But the Bible also is so specific on, like, think about the genealogies in Genesis and how it specifies the age of each person, in the line from like Adam to Noah,
True. Maybe
that they had been tracking something
that's
that
true.
they knew how
That's
old they
true.
were. So
Maybe they were guesstimating.
sometimes I wonder that, like, if the reason that they were living 900 and something years was a year 365 days, or was
Well,
it
I guess actually
different?
that's a good point. If starting from when the mother gives birth to the child, if they track to the moons and they did 12 moons and then you just kept tracking 12 moons, then you would know, all right, we've tracked 700 moons. I'm very old now.
The Hebrew calendar, though, is a different amount of months. I'm pretty sure it's 13 months.
Oh man.
So
Who
this is
knows? How do I even know what's going on right now?
that we're back into getting convoluted in calendars.
Yeah.
Calendars really confuse us.
Calendars are a trick. There's something going on
Yeah.
here. We need to
So
find an expert on this. If anybody listening knows any experts on calendars, on dating.
Jay Carper of American Torah, he might.
Let's talk to Jay. We need
I'll ask him if he has any kind of insights on how calendars came to be the
What
way they
year is it, Jay? What is actually going on? Can you
are.
please tell us what year it really is? Because we're lost. Anyway.
This really would be a great episode. I
Yeah.
mean, not for you and I to figure out, but to have someone teach us.
Yeah, to have someone teach us about it, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, something else I thought was interesting about what you said was you said Zechariah,
Yeah.
Zech, which is a variation of Zechariah,
Yeah.
Zach. All the Zachs out there are not going to like Zech.
Well,
And the Zachs.
I mean, it's the way that the books of the Bible spelled it.
Yeah, but it's a variation.
Yeah, yeah, a variation.
Anyway,
Yeah.
we don't need to get into all this. I have too many offshoots. You're never going to get to the end of this episode. The Feast of Tabernacles is never going to end. So
Yeah.
keep
Okay,
going,
so
and I'm going to be
back to
quiet.
why I believe back to why I believe Yeshua was born on the first
Your
day of
birthday, October 4th.
No. I'm not going to name dates. I'm not a date setter. So, from the gospel accounts and with an understanding of how the Levitical priesthood worked, we can actually determine when John the Baptist was conceived. The reason for it is because we're given details about his father, Zechariah, who was a priest, and he was serving in the temple, and it actually specifies even what order of the priests he was. So with a bit of digging, which I'm not going to get into all the specifics right now because it would take like 10 minutes to explain, but with a bit of digging, we can calculate exactly when
We don't
he
have
was
that kind of time.
Yeah, exactly. We can calculate exactly when he was serving in the temple and told by the angel that his wife Elizabeth would conceive. And then later in the Gospels, we read that Mary comes to visit Elizabeth when she's 6 months pregnant, and John jumps in her womb at the presence of the Savior. So with all these details of these events, when you do the digging, it is apparent that Yeshua would have been born in either late September or early October, according to our current calendar. And this is right when Sukkot falls every year. But really, for me, what gives the strongest clue is what John says in the very first chapter of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Skipping ahead a little bit. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So many translations may use the word dwelt there instead of tabernacled, which is unfortunate because the Greek word used is, I might not pronounce it correctly, but skene, which is literally the verb form for sukkah or tabernacle. The better translation is he tabernacled among us. And John writes later in chapter 7 about Yeshua visiting the temple during the Feast of Booths. So I believe he specified the word Yeshua becoming flesh to tabernacle with us because he was referencing his birth at the Feast of Tabernacles. Because he would have known for sure. But he didn't set a date. So many believe there's even more significance to this because if he were born on the first day of Sukkot, then like every good Jew, he would have been circumcised on the 8th day of his life. So he would have been circumcised on the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles as well.
We can't get into this because we don't have time, but we need to talk about circumcision at some point and like what that actually means, but just keep going.
Okay. So I've heard good arguments that he was actually born in a sukkah. And this is what the innkeeper supplied them with as a shelter outside, since he had no more rooms in his inn. But because he was a Jew, he would have had a sukkah set up outside if this were taking place during Sukkot. So from everything I read from God's word about how detailed and specific he has been, especially with Yeshua's fulfillment in the spring feast, wouldn't it only make sense that the timing of his son, the long-awaited Messiah, who would fulfill hundreds of prophecies, will be born on a very special day to Yahweh, a day that the Jews would revere as anticipating the coming of the king who would rule Israel and all the nations? And at his birth, the king, truly came to earth. I just find this so much more special than celebrating a man-made winter solstice date. But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, we'll be talking about the history of Christmas, which is what you're referring to.
Yeah.
In a little while. And by a little while, I don't mean today. Another day.
Yeah. Yeah. So the final note I want to make about this special Feast of Tabernacles and what it will mean when Yeshua returns and this final feast is fulfilled is about the symbolism of the booth or tabernacle or tent. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 5, "For we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this house we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, inasmuch as we, having put it on, will not be found naked. For indeed, while we are in this tent, we groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal will be swallowed up by life. Now he who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave to us the Spirit as a pledge." Wouldn't you know it, but the same Greek word Paul used that was translated to tent is that same scanos. The one that I'm having a hard time pronouncing, but it's
Sounds right to me. I can't pronounce
root
anything.
word that John also used referring to a tabernacle. I believe the significance here and behind the Feast of Sukkot that God wants us to remember as we keep it from year to year is that these bodies we are currently in, much like the Sukkah, are fragile and frail, but he sustains these flesh tents through this life, just like he sustained the Israelites in the wilderness. And more importantly, a day is coming when we will put off these flesh tents or these tabernacles and put on our glorified bodies. And in that day, we will be tabernacling with the Lord for all eternity. And this is the ultimate meaning of this Feast of Tabernacles. That's why we keep it from year to year, and we can reflect on the goodness of Yahweh from the past, while also looking forward to his goodness at the fulfillment of this feast.
Yeah.
So that concludes our deep dive on all 7 of the biblical feasts. We did it.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I know this has been long and detailed, and actually I could have been even more detailed. So believe it or not, but this was all my amateur summary of things I've learned about God's holy days. So I hope everyone who has taken the time to listen to these episodes will be edified and blessed by them. And if I could end with one sentiment, it's that the Lord has immensely blessed me these past 3 years as I've learned and grown through keeping his feasts. And all glory goes to him.
Very cool, Ray. Thank you for sharing all this with all of us.
Yeah, thank you for
I know
listening.
you put a lot of time into preparing and prayer into preparing to share this with folks, because as we know, like, not a lot of people necessarily get the deep dive. Most people don't. Christians these days get a deep dive into these feasts unless they're pursuing it themselves or with groups similar to your groups. Now, there are a couple of resources that have been mentioned throughout these episodes. We'll mention them again. I'll have them in the show notes. And that is the book by Sam Nadler that Rachel's been referring to, Messiah in the Feast of Israel. And then the second book is by David Wilbur, A Christian Guide to the Biblical Feasts. And both of those books have lots of details and things like that that might help folks out. And I know most people probably are wondering, well, how do I as a Christian keep this feast, this last feast? I think we got some good ideas from you though, because you did share kind of some real world, real life examples of this is how my church group does it. We get
Yeah.
together, we pitch our tents,
Mhm.
we camp outside, we worship together, we have food, we have messages, we focus on our time with the Lord. And I think that you'd probably say the same thing for any of the feasts that we talked about, that's the point of all of it, right? Is community, getting together, focusing on the Lord, his provisions and all he has done, remembering what people have been through all of this as they've served the Lord and all that they've suffered through. And yeah, that's my summary from your explanation.
Yeah, no, I think that that's perfect. That if there is a pattern in at least what I am personally doing to keep and honor these feasts today, it's just like you said, it's assembling with other people, with the church, worshiping, praying, and fellowshipping. And that's and each one might have a little bit different details. Like on the Feast of Trumpets, we're outside blowing shofars. On the Feast of Tabernacles, we're actually spending more time together and camping. Passover has a whole order of events, and things might look a little bit different. And that's how they are all so unique.
Yeah.
But all of them, we are remembering, and we're discussing how Yeshua is in this feast with us. It all goes back to him. It's all about him.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing all this with us, Ray. We appreciate it. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope that you have learned a lot about this. I know I have. And thank you so much for being on this journey with us. If you'd like to follow along outside the podcast, be sure to join the mission on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube at The Radiant Mission. And we are going to close with Revelation 21, verses 3 through 4. Rachel knows there's only one way I can hear anything from Revelation after doing the study on the Bible app, and it's with this man who has sort of a Britishish accent. But I'll try really hard to read this like a normal person. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them. And they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning, or crying, or pain. The first things have passed away." And we're wishing you a radiant week. See you next time.